on the school-based large-scale international studies, TIMSS, PISA, TALIS, etc. So I'm very happy to be moderating this session. I'm very happy to be welcoming a few AIR colleagues to this panel. There will be one presentation for this session, one presentation on the PISA Socio-Economic Status Index. And presenting will be Juliet Holmes, a research associate, and Dr. Markus Broer, a principal researcher at AIR. And our discussant will be joining us remotely, Dr. George Bohrnstedt, who is a senior vice president and institute fellow at AIR. And I want to point out that the members of this panel have a very impressive body of research that they've done using data from our U.S. National Assessment, NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Feel free to read the bios for their full bios. Today's presentation is actually based on some earlier work that they've done using NAEP data as well as TIMSS data, which is the International Assessment in Math and Science. So we're very excited to hear about this new work that you've done using the PIAAC data. And as with the other sessions, we expect that there will be time at the end to take questions and answers. So without further ado, welcome, welcome to our presenters. I think Juliet.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Juliet Holmes, and along with my colleague, Markus Broer, we will be discussing to you today relations between socioeconomic status and skills in PIAAC. Socioeconomic status, or SES, has been defined as access to financial, social, cultural, and human capital resources. There are the three big components of SES: education, occupation, and income. We all know that SES is important. Low SES has been associated with worse educational and health outcomes. We know that there's some relationship between SES with other socio-demographic characteristics, such as gender, native language, age, and race ethnicity. The APA states that SES is a consistent and reliable predictor of a vast array of outcomes across the lifespan, including physical and psychological health. Thus, SES is relevant to all realms of behavioral and social sciences, including research, practice. On the other hand, the maximum SES value is 15 if the respondent had the highest index value for each of the 5 components. So looking at our R-squared value for PIAAC, or SES index, we explain about 33% of the variation in literacy and about 34% of the variation in numeracy. In comparison, the ESCS, R-squared value is about 15%. That is the PISA SES measure. It stands for Economic, Social, and Cultural Status. And then for the R-squared value for NAEP grade 12, using the same methodology that we use for this PIAAC SES index, we got explaining about 23% of the variation. And for our SES variable, we get a almost normal-looking distribution ranging from 0 to 15, although we did not display the results for 15 because there are not enough cases for reliable estimate. And next, I will hand over the clicker to my colleague, Markus Broer.
Thank you. So how is this SES index related to numeracy levels? We see here on the x-axis the number of SES index points, and on the y-axis the numeracy score, scale score. And we see that there is basically a monotonically rising function. We see that each additional SES index point is associated with higher mean proficiency levels, skill levels. And the whole index spans a wide spectrum from, put the benchmark levels there. So from the lowest level of 0 points, which corresponds to a mean around level 1 through level 4. So this index spans a very wide range, about 2.5 standard deviations, And when we define low and high SES groups by looking at the bottom and top quartiles of those SES index in the SES index, we still see a very strong differentiation, about 1.5 standard deviations difference between low and high SES respondents in numeracy skills. Now we're looking here at this is just exploratory. We don't have a very substantive question. We're looking at skills differences by racial ethnic subgroups, and we can see that the skills difference between high and low SES students are the skills gaps exist both at the high end and the low end. And if we look at the skills gaps, there's slight variation, but the skill gap is largely largely similar between racial ethnic groups. However, there's of course a big disparity in the number and in the distribution of the subgroups in the low and high SES groups. So in the high SES group, you can find the majority of white students. In the low SES group, you can find a majority of Black and Hispanic students. So what we're trying to see is then how SES can explain some of those these skill gaps. And we do that through a linear regression model. We're looking at first at a base model where we have gender, race, ethnicity, and native English language speaker status, which is important, especially for explaining also the white Hispanic skill gaps. This is our base model, gives us more or less the observed achievement gaps. Then we add parental education, which is normally used, get a sense of how much of the skills gap is explained by this very limited SES proxy, and then we use our SES index instead to see how that would how that comes out. So there's a lot of numbers here, but what I want to focus here for at the moment is this slightly out of place red box, which should be around the R-squared values. So the base model explains about 16% of the variation in numeracy scores. If we add parental education as an SES proxy, we get a higher R-squared. We explain more of the variation. But as we can see, as we enter childhood, the childhood SES index, the adulthood index, and finally the full proposed SES index, we explain a much larger variation of the numeracy scores. So numeracy skills. So parental education about 25%. If we use instead the SES index, it's about 40% of the variation that we explain. I do want to focus on what's a little bit buried among all these numbers about the skills gaps, white, Black skills gaps, and white Hispanic skill gaps. So I'll pull this out here. And so the base model shows more or less the observed skill gaps between white and Black students, 51 points, and white and Hispanic students, 39 points. And what should really worry researchers who use parental education alone as an SES proxy for a US data set specifically is the variation, the remaining unexplained achievement gap between white and Black respondents is really almost no. You almost see no reduction. You see almost no explanation here. You had 51 points before. Now it's 47 points. There's just 4 points of that large skill gap is explained when you use SES parental education as an SES proxy. It's still very largely unexplained when you use the wider model, the wider index that we propose, but it's substantially more explained of that black skills gap, and for white Hispanic skills gap, it's actually largely explained. More than half of the white Hispanic skill gap is explained by differences in SES levels. So conclusion, this is really just a proof of concept. We don't have a very substantive research question at the moment, but we know that having a more effective control variable for SES than parental education would be important. We know that at least for it is important in explaining better explaining skills gaps for racial ethnic groups in the US. And we know that analysis without a more nuanced indicator of SES may overestimate the effect of predictors on the outcome. So that's kind of the reason why we want to do this and why we try to encourage researchers to use a more comprehensive measure of SES. We don't have a good research question or a substantive outcome question where we can prove this, but based on previous work that we did with NAEP, we know very well that you use a wider measure of SES, some of the predictor variables that before appear to be significant and have a much larger effect when you just use parental education. When you use the wider measure of SES, you actually, this relationship becomes much smaller and the significance disappears. So that's important because we want to focus, and specifically policymakers want to focus on malleable factors for policy initiatives and identifying potential predictors that might affect outcome that can be put to rigorous testing. And here are some references, and if you have questions, maybe now or by email.
Okay, and Dr. George Bohrnstedt will be our discussant. We'll probably see him momentarily.
Well, let me thank Juliet and Markus for this presentation. Markus has done just some remarkably good work on developing the SES index and SES index for NAEP work. So I was excited to see this. Clearly, the measurement of SES is a key component of mixed affecting adults. We know that SES has been shown to be related to important adult outcomes such as health and mental health, as they pointed out, and as well as labor-related outcomes such as occupational mobility. So the better our measures of SES, the better our predictions for these kinds of important outcomes. For this reason, Juliet and Markus' decision to use an index measure of SES with PIAAC rather than simply using parent education as a surrogate is a laudatory move. That said, there are a couple of conceptual issues I felt that they might want to think about. First, two components comprise their SES measure, childhood and adult SES. The main conceptual issue is this. To what degree should childhood SES be a component of current SES, given that the PIAAC sampled adults? So, for example, if a respondent is a 65-year-old woman, does it make sense conceptually that childhood SES should be a component of her SES? Demographers typically separate the two, and indeed an important area of study for them is intergenerational mobility. The relationship between SES of origin, child SES in this case, and SES of destination, adult SES. The second conceptual issue is a more minor one. One of the items used in the measure of adult SES, called observed SES status, the question asks what social class the interviewer would place the respondent in. That is, the question is more about class than SES. And while the definitions of class and SES are often conflated, class typically includes cultural, social, and behavioral components, as well as the economic one, including SES. Given this, some might argue that the inclusion of the observed SES status item muddied rather than clarified their measurement of SDS. These conceptual issues noted, the results that Juliet and Markus have shown indicate quite clearly that their measures significantly improve the prediction of both PIAAC literacy and numeracy compared to using only parental education. Now, some may question why simply adding the components together and using simple 0 to 3 or 0 to 4 scales is appropriate. But as it turns out, as they show, the distribution of scores is nearly normal in shape. And the relationship between their SDS measure and the two PIAAC scores is nearly linear. These are both very nice characteristics of their measure. They also show convincingly that their measure helps better explain achievement gaps for racial ethnic groups than by simply using parental education. These are important positive attributes of their measure, and they're not to be minimized. But it's worth noting that the results also show that both the child and adult components of SES make independent contributions to the prediction of PIAAC literacy and numeracy scores, as well as the achievement gaps. These findings suggest that the two measures are not substitutable to one another. That is, they're not measuring exactly the same construct. This fact, the fact that they make independent contributions to the prediction of both scores, leads one back to the main conceptual question of whether the child SES component should be summed to the adult SES component into a total SES measure. Are we muddying the conceptual waters by doing so? As a relevant aside, in deciding how independent child and adult SES are, it would have been useful if they had reported the correlation between these two measures. It might have also been useful to see a factor out of all of them. Are they loading on a single SES factor or on two separate factors, that is a child factor and an adult factor? These conceptual issues aside, it's important to note the limitation of the use of parental SES as the sole measure of SES is currently done by PIAAC. In addition to the limitation of any single indicator of a measure, parental education also suffers from the fact that in this case, it's a measure of child SES. As such, it could be argued that it really misses the most focused measure of current adult SES. So this is a strong rationale for doing what, in fact, they're doing. In summary, Juliet and Markus' approach to the measure of SES and PIAAC is important move in the right direction. But as I've noted, there are some conceptual issues they will want to think through with respect to exactly what components should be included in the measures and which not. Thank you.
Thank you, George.